Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on the basics of Jewish American genealogy. My name is Kathleen McKenzie, Education and Programming Manager, and I will be your moderator for today's program. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. We are also home to the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center, a destination for exploring and preserving the history of Jewish families and institutions in New England and beyond. This program today is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. Our presenter today is senior genealogist Rhonda R. McClure. Rhonda is a nationally recognized professional genealogist and lecturer. Before joining American Ancestors/NEHGS in 2006, she ran her own genealogical business for 18 years. She was a contributing editor for Heritage Quest magazine, Biography magazine, and was a contributor to the History Channel magazine and American History magazine. In addition to numerous articles, she is the author of 12 books, including the award-winning The Complete Idiot's Guide to Online Genealogy, Finding Your Famous and Infamous Ancestors, and Digitizing Your Family History. She is also the editor of the recently released 6th edition of the Genealogist's Handbook for New England Research. Her areas of expertise include immigration and naturalization, late 19th and early 20th century urban research, New England, Midwest, Southern, German, Italian, Scottish, Irish, French Canadian, and New Brunswick research. Today, there are an estimated 7.6 million Jewish Americans living in the country, the majority of whom descend from diaspora Jewish populations from Central and Eastern Europe. Learning how to trace your Jewish ancestry is not without its challenges. Changing surnames, locating your ancestor's home village or shtetl, and access to overseas records are just the tip of the iceberg. This webinar will discuss the historical context of your ancestors' arrival in the United States, review American records that can be helpful in your research, and provide basic strategies for uncovering your ancestors' exact origins in the Old Country. Rhonda will present for about 45 minutes, and then we will have time for questions at the end. At any point during the presentation, please type your question in the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. There's also a syllabus available for purchase at our online bookstore, and you should find a link to that in your reminder email, and I'll also include it in my follow-up email after today's broadcast. We are recording this event, and starting later today, you can freely go back and review any of the content from the presentation on our website, as well as on our YouTube channel. So without further ado, I will go ahead and turn things over to Rhonda.
Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. And to get started, we're going to jump off with where do you begin in researching your Jewish ancestry? Well, the biggest thing is that it's really, really important that you begin with yourself. Always work from the known to the unknown, working backwards. You want to talk to family that are, nearby and those who live, far away. Write down all the stories that are known or suspected, anything that they share with you. This is going to be the basis that's going to allow you to then research in the records in the US. And it's important that you look at all the records in the United States. Don't just look at census and see, oh, they came over in such and such a year and immediately jump. You need to exhaust everything. Cemeteries can often offer important information about origins. Also, you want to understand some of the migration patterns. So what is the big difference when it comes to Jewish research? One of the biggest differences is names. Names can be under a lot of different variations. Your ancestor has a Hebrew name. They may have a Yiddish name. Coming from Eastern Europe, they may also have a local Eastern European name. And once they've gotten here to the United States, they may have anglicized their name. The border changes of the countries and name changes of the towns back in Eastern Europe add a level of difficulty in isolating where your ancestors came from. And then, of course, there's a variety of languages and in the records that you will be finding once you do get into the old country. So let's talk about names for just a moment. The name variations, as I said, all Jewish individuals have a Hebrew name that they are given at birth. And you can see a couple of female variations here. So we have Rachel for the Hebrew name. The Yiddish is Rachel. The Eastern European name may be something along the lines of Rushla. And then sometimes they Americanize it to a name that doesn't seem to have anything to do with the Hebrew name, in this case, Mary. Another example is the Hebrew is Basha, the Yiddish is Beshe. The possible Eastern European name is Becky, and then the Americanized name is Bessie. For males, we have a couple of examples here. On the left, Shlomo is the Hebrew, Shlomi is the Yiddish, Shloma is the Eastern European name, and Solomon is the Americanized name. On the right, we have Mordecai, which is his Hebrew name. Marx is the Yiddish. The Eastern European is a different spelling variation of Mordecai, and then the Americanized name is Max. One of the best resources for learning about the variations in the names is found on JewishGen.org. They have lots of great resources on their website. They encourage you to be a member so that you have additional search variations, but the URL that you see at the bottom of this slide will take you directly to the given name search. On the right, the red search starts with the European country, and below you can choose your European country, put in the given name that you want, and then it will search the variations. On the right hand, the blue side is the foreign country, in other words, where they emigrated to. It defaults to the United States, and again, you can put in a surname, a given name such as Solomon or Bessie, and see what it gives you. To walk you through that, we have here the Mordecai that we showed you as a variation, and you will see that at the very, very top, we have the legal/Hebrew, which is Mordecai, and then it walks us through the variations. So the Yiddish, there may be a number of Yiddish nicknames, local secular, and then the US name. And so you can see from this example that there are a variety of ways that your ancestor, if he was a Mordecai, could have arrived in the US under many, many of those Yiddish nicknames. So this is why we have some difficulty finding our ancestors. There are a number of different records here in the US that may help you in identifying a Hebrew name. Some of them include a ketubah, the marriage contract, the bris for the boys when the boys are circumcised, a girl's naming document, the get, which is a Jewish divorce, and the tombstones. Something to keep in mind about naming traditions, Ashkenazi Jews do not name children after living individuals. So when they name a newborn, it's often after a close deceased relative, but the relative must be deceased for that Hebrew name. The Sephardic Jews, however, will name their children after both living and deceased family. Let's talk about places. Once again, Jewish research requires that you have to research more than just your family. You also have to identify the place where they came from and then determine the history of that place to account for things such as changing administrations, changing borders, record destruction based on wars, for just a couple of examples. your research in Jewish history, family history is likely to leave the US in just a couple of generations. One of the main areas that our ancestors came from is the Pale of Settlement. This was the section of Russia in which Jews were required to reside. This particular map here shows the Pale of Settlement, and then because I used it in a case I was working on, you can see that I've highlighted certain areas and made notes about certain towns. The areas that you see here have become additional countries. So if we zoom in on that map that I was just looking at, we can see that Traby is in present-day Belarus, while Kletsk is also in Belarus. So that area that I have kind of highlighted, both of those are in what is now known as Belarus. However, the names have changed a little bit. The town of Elizabethgrad is in what we would recognize as the present-day Ukraine, and that town is now known as Kirovohrad. So name changes of countries and towns just add to the difficulty that we have in making sure we're researching in the right area. Again, returning to JewishGen.org, their communities database is the best place to get started, especially if you're having a little difficulty with how the name should be spelled. So if we type into the community, then we can do a search. In this case, I put in Kletsk, and you'll see that on the far left-hand side is its present-day town name and the country in which it is attached to. If you look at the columns over on the right, starting from the far right, the number of GJFF entries, that is the number of JewishGen Family Finder entries. In other words, people who are researching in this town. The next column to its left tells you what the name was about circa 1900, so before World War I, and gives you town, district, province, and country. Going one more to the left, now we are at about 1930, so we're between World War I and World War II. And again, we have town, district, province, and country. And then finally, the furthest right of these four is about 1950, so we're after World War II, and it gives us the name of the town and country. Between the modern and the circa 1950, you will see other names for the town, and these are usually identified by the language spoken. So some of them will look very, very similar, but you may see, based on the Yiddish versus the Russian, that there are some variations. If you click the little icon to the left of the modern town name, that will take you to information about the town. Among other things, you will see on the far right the nearby Jewish communities. So it's very possible that your ancestor picked like the big town from the area that they were from, similar to how when I'm talking to people up in Boston, I say I'm from Brighton. But when I'm talking to people who are down in Florida, my family who don't know the area, I tell them I'm from Boston because it is the biggest city. So you may find that the actual origin of your ancestor is one of the nearby Jewish communities. Zooming in, we can see that they give us all the information that was on the initial search up top. And among other things, we get the Yixer books and the Kahila links, which can give you some valuable information about the community. At the bottom, below the map, you will find some available databases and/or special interest group collections that might be of use in your search. Understanding the history of the Jewish people is essential to effectively researching your ancestors. Two books that I recommend are Ronald Sanders' Shores of Refuge, 100 Years of Jewish Emigration, and Israel Bartels' The Jews of Eastern Europe, 1772 to 1881. Another very useful resource is the Routledge Atlas of Jewish History by Martin Gilbert. There is an ebook version of this, but I really suggest that you get the paperback version. The ebook is very difficult to read all the text in with the different maps, and all the maps have a lot of text. This particular atlas includes 157 maps that cover themes of prejudice and violence, migration and movements, society, trade and culture, as well as politics, government, and war. The particular map that we are looking at right here is kind of a timeline of the Jewish settlements in New York City and population totals from 1812 to 1968. Of particular interest is the Lower East Side, which is the area that I have highlighted with the red arrow, which in 1904 contained 64,000 Jewish families living in less than 6,000 tenements. Martin further points out that they had 306 synagogues. For those of you who may have your ancestors who are coming from the area of Galicia, there is a great volume by Susan Wynne, The Galicianers, the Jews of Galicia, 1772 to 1918. Going forward with some of our history, the Sephardic Jewish migration traces back to the 1600s. The earliest Jewish arrivals came from Brazil, arriving in what was then New Amsterdam in 1654. The 23 immigrants were part of the diaspora that dated back to the 1492 expulsion of Jews from Spain. Many who emigrated to Portugal from Spain became crypto-Jews, those who practiced their Judaism in secret. Pre-American Revolution, both Sephardic and Ashkenazic merchants began to establish homes in colonial ports, including Newport, Rhode Island, New Amsterdam, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. You can see in the map on the right some of the dates of when those areas were founded. By 1730, the Ashkenazi Jews outnumbered the Sephardic Jews in the American colonies. The nature of the American Jewish community, however, was still Sephardic. Through the American Revolution, colonial synagogues adhered to Sephardic ritual and controlled all aspects of Jewish religious life. Between 1820 and 1880, Jews were emigrating predominantly from Central Europe. Many of them, not surprisingly, settled in the bigger cities of New York City, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. The German-speaking Jewish groups, however, were settling in places such as Albany, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Louisville, Minneapolis, New Orleans, St. Louis, and San Francisco. Most of the Jewish immigrants in this time period were coming from one of these four provinces, state, duchies, whatever you want to call them, of Bavaria, Baden, Württemberg, and Posen. They left Germany to get away from repressive legislation and disruptions to the agricultural peasant economy. The German Jews came from small hamlets and market towns. As such, they were traditionally tradesmen and cattle dealers. They suffered from taxes, limitations on their right to marry, difficulties finding employment, and troubles finding places to live. Between 1881 and 1924, we see a large explosion of Jewish immigrants. In 1880, roughly 1/6 of the 250,000 American Jews were Eastern European immigrants. By 1920, those immigrants and their children made up almost 5/6 of the 4 million Jews in America. So you see this shift to those from Eastern European from the Pale. And you'll see that the card on the right was a Happy New Year postcard that shows the Jews with traditional dress, those on the right carrying their packs of their belongings, standing under the Imperial Russian coat of arms. They are being welcomed by the Jews who have already emigrated to the US, and you can see that they have adopted the dress of America. Between 1881 and 1924, we see that population explosion. From 1800 to 1900, Jewish population in Eastern Europe went from 1.5 million to 6.8 million. They were all still confined to the Pale of Settlement. 75% of the immigrants to the United States came from the Pale of Settlement. 18% came from Galicia, Bukovina, and Hungary, and then 4% came from Romania. The reasons for immigrating were vast. There was a large increase of the population. Industrialization and modern agriculture was playing a factor. Of course, the pogroms of mob violence that ushered in 3 decades of anti-Jewish actions. There was also the May laws of 1882 and other economic policies of pauperization. The May laws were supposed to be a temporary measure until general revision was made of the legal status. It decreed that the Jews be forbidden to settle anew outside of towns and boroughs, except being admitted only in the case of existing Jewish agricultural colonies. They were temporarily forbidden from being of issuing mortgages and other deeds to Jews, as well as the registration of Jews as lessees of real property, situated again outside of towns and boroughs. Also, the issuing to Jews of powers of attorney to manage and dispose of such real property. Finally, Jews were forbidden to transact business on Sundays and on other principal Christian holy days. The existing regulations concerning the closing of such places of business belonging to the Christians on such days was required to apply to the Jews also. So you saw these economic policies playing a role, and those were just augmenting and causing additional pauperization. Then, of course, you had the banishments from Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kharkov, and the 1905 revolution. In 1882, following the pogroms of 1881 and 1882, 13,000 Jews immigrated. This was almost half the number of those who had arrived in the entire 1870s decade. By 1891, that number was up to 50,000. From 1900 to 1914, 1.5 million immigrants arrived. And then from 1906 to roughly 1916, more than 100,000 Jewish immigrants were arriving annually. In 1906 alone, 152,000 came, comprising 14% of the total number of immigrants for that year. Like many others, the father of a family often came first and was then followed by his wife and children. The migration patterns explain to you sort of how the Jews were getting to the ports needed to ultimately get to the United States. So the Jews from southern Russia crossed into Austro-Hungary and then on to Vienna or Berlin, where they would ultimately get a train to a port. Jews from Western Russia, however, crossed into Germany and then straight to Berlin. Most of the Jews then headed to the transatlantic ports of Hamburg, Bremen, Rotterdam, Amsterdam, and Antwerp. Of course, all of this immigration and the numbers of individuals who were arriving did cause some concerns in the United States. So many of the Jewish immigrants were poor that many feared that they would require public aid. As a result, immigration laws were in general starting to get tighter, identifying an ever-growing list of what they considered to be unacceptable immigrants. Post-1924, the quota restrictions began to limit the number of Jews who could receive visas to enter the US. Sadly, in Nazi-occupied areas, the Jews were not allowed passports, which meant they couldn't get a visa. Some did manage affidavits. However, the quota restrictions were not adjusted to assist Jews from escaping Nazi Germany. Let's talk a moment about some of the research we can do in the US records. For purposes of today, we're going to look at vital records, census, we're going to talk a little about newspapers, naturalization records, and passenger lists. Again, always work from the known to the unknown, especially because of the naming variations that you're going to come upon. Here we have a marriage record between John E. Frankfurt and Shirley Gutman. In this record, we see that John was a pharmacist, that he was born in Wilmington, Delaware. His father was Solomon, his mother was Mary Spritsky. Shirley's father was Louis Gutman, and her mother was Bessie Rosenfeld. It was a first marriage for both of them. When you are looking at marriage records for your Jewish ancestors, always pay close attention to who was marrying them. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Here in the 1920 census, we see the family of Solomon Frankfurt. He is the 800th individual family that was done, and no, he was on 800, the 800 house number. He was dwelling number 45 and family number 67. Solomon and Mary had a number of children. Only they were born in Russia. Then their oldest child, Isidore, was born in New York, and then Nathan, their next son, was actually born in Russia, which tells us that at least Mary herself went back to Russia for some reason, perhaps to bring over some of her family, we don't know. And then the rest of the children, Emma was born in New York, and then ultimately they showed up in Delaware. So looking at a marriage, again, this one for Solomon and Mary, they got married in New York, and you'll see Solomon Frankfurt and Mary Spritsky. And we have the signature of the individual who performed the ceremony, which was Wolf Zuckman. We're going to tip this certificate and look at the information filled out on the bottom that is kind of sideways on this particular record. What you'll see is basically the information identifying when the marriage took place, information about Solomon Frankfurt, where he was living, his age, was he single or widowed, his birthplace, and his parents' names. And then we see also the same for Mary Spritsky. However, the part that I've highlighted that is very, very important is the name of the person who was performing the ceremony, again, Wolf Zuckerman, and the official station. He was the rabbi of Love of Israel Synagogue and his residence. This information may be able to help you in identifying where your ancestor was coming from. A lot of the synagogues in the time frame up to 1906, especially, with the mass of people who were arriving, they often would group together with others from their origins, and their synagogue would be formed. So again, many of these synagogues were founded by those individuals from the same area. Yes, they were all, predominantly in that Lower East Side. But as I mentioned in Martin, in that map guide, there were 306 synagogues in 1906. So finding the name of the synagogue on a marriage record can actually lead you to other resources that may pave the way to the shtetl in the Old Country. Another great resource is the Jewish Communal Directory, which was published in 1912. This can be a huge help for Ancestry in New York City. Here we see the Jewish Communal Directory. This is something that you can find digitally online. And it was a classified guidebook to the congregations, fraternal orders, etc., all pertaining to the Jews of the 5 boroughs of New York City. As we can see, as we open it up, we have here some of the local federations and some of the affiliated societies that were in existence, along with the address of where they could be found. Another great resource is the Synagogues of New York City. This is available online from the museumofFamilyHistory.com at the URL you see at the bottom. What they have done is they have taken and mined the city directories of New York City from 1860 to 1933, identifying all of the synagogues, their addresses, if there was a known association with a particular place, and sometimes the changes of the name of the synagogue and who was maybe the rabbi and others who were involved with that particular synagogue. Naturalization records are another great resource when it comes to looking for information about our ancestors. The later your ancestor naturalized, the more information you're going to find. After 1906, the Immigration and Naturalization Service standardized the naturalization forms. However, earlier naturalizations should not be ignored. They too can give you good, useful information. Here we have the petition for naturalization for Solomon Frankfurt. Remember that naturalization was a 3-step process. There was the declaration of intention, petition for naturalization, and then the actual certificate of naturalization that showed that the individual was a US citizen. Here we see that Solomon was doing this in Wilmington, Delaware, but because he's doing this so much later, there's a lot of questions that were asked and information that he was required to supply, including his full birth date and place. One of the things that you may want to do is to keep an ongoing research notebook. You can do this electronically using something like OneNote by Microsoft. You'll see here at the time, I was using just a simple spiral bound notebook to make notes. I've always been a color-coded person. So with his petition, I abstracted the information that was pertinent, and then I used that to look for other information about the family. So, he said that he immigrated from Glasgow, Scotland in 1892. Turned out he actually immigrated in 1890, but, he gave the name of the ship, which was huge. Then we could also see when he left New York City and arrived in DC, in Delaware, based on the births of his children. And so you'll see that I have made some notations of things that I found, such as birth certificates and other items of information. Passenger list. This is sometimes the hardest record in which to find your Jewish immigrants. And it's in large part because they often arrived under their Yiddish name or Yiddish nickname. This makes identifying your ancestor a lot harder. Couple that with misindexing and typos of the indexes that have been created by online databases, and you run into additional problems. Also, the traditional soundex searching that we would often use for other surnames is seldom useful for the Eastern European surnames, in large part because of the number of consonants that often are together, but only have a single sound. One of the things that you may want to do, though, is to look and see if there's perhaps a departure list. Using Solomon Frankfurt as our example, we have here, I did a search on Solomon, and you'll notice that I have put in a lot of wildcards for the name. Ancestry requires a minimum of 3 letters in the first and middle name and the last name fields. However, they do not have to be side by side. So you could have an like the wildcard asterisk after each letter. What I did for his first name, because I knew him as Solomon here in the US, was to look and see, based on the various Hebrew and Yiddish names I knew for him, what were the common letters that were likely to appear regardless of how he came over. And that was what I used for his first and middle names. And then because I knew that his name could be Frankfurt and with a URT, an ORT, ERT, I did just Frank and the star. And then I used his arrival date that he told me of 1892, and I enlarged that to plus or minus 5 years. As a result, I got about 22 hits with various spellings and obviously individuals that clearly weren't him. A lot of Frankels that I knew were not him because they were claiming to be Polish. The Hamburg passenger list actually turned out to be my best bet. Again, I went back, I did the same wildcard searching for him. I did the departure date of 1892 plus or minus 5 years. In the results that came up, I found Shlomo Frankfurt, who I've highlighted with the big red arrow, and that he was going to Glasgow from Hamburg. Now, unfortunately, the Bremen passenger exit lists do not begin as early as the Hamburg list. Hamburg begins in the 1850s. The Bremen lists don't begin until the 1900s. In choosing Shlomo and looking at his information that was supplied, number one, keep in mind the Hamburg lists were in German. So a lot of the information that you see in the abstract is German, including his occupation, his residence, his, the type of ship, etc. Looking at the original, I found that Shlomo, not only was he saying his last residence was Elisabethgrad, but he also seemed to be traveling at the age of 17. He seemed to be traveling with a slightly younger female who was age 11, who was named Selda. So could be a sister or a cousin. It was hard to know based on this record. From there, I went to look at the arrivals for 1890, because now I discovered that he was off by 2 years. And I looked for the ship, Indiana, and I used just his last name with the wildcard search to see if I could find his arrival. And I found him arriving from Glasgow, and you'll see why we didn't find him before. It was because they have actually used an I instead of an O. They have misread his name on the passenger list. So zooming in, not sure why they thought it was an I, but you can see Shlomo, Frankfurt, and Zelda. They also had Frank over for his surname. One of the resources, especially if they were coming into New York, Philadelphia, Boston, is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. It was founded in response to Jews fleeing the pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe. In 1904, they actually established a bureau on Ellis Island, and in 1911, they actually had a kosher kitchen installed on Ellis Island. However, this is not the only port at which they would assist immigrants. For those arriving in the Port of Boston, you can use the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society Boston Port Digital Archives through the Jewish Heritage Center, the Weiner Jewish Heritage Center attached to our AmericanAncestors.org website. This particular collection is massive, and as you can see over on the right, there are a number of different series, including case files, ship arrivals, and then the individual arrival cards, which is what most people want to look at. Here we see Yenta Spuck, who was 28 years old. She was a female. She was married. One of the interesting things about the arrival cards is that they often will mention if they spent any time somewhere. And so in this case, Yenta spent 12 weeks in Novgorod, and her final destination was Boston, Massachusetts, where she was going to join her husband. Always look for the back side of the card. In her case, we see a lot of information. She was detained, waiting for her husband to come and get her. We learned that he was a marble worker at the corner off Portland Street and Chardon Streets for Aaron Carr. So we know who his employer was, how much he was making per hour. There was actually a hearing for her. So the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society was assisting her with what was going on. In addition to Yenta, we also see Motel, age 9, Itzik, age 7, and Shinelik, age 1, who were with her. Tombstones. This is another very, very useful U.S. resource. One of the most valuable resources for identifying a father's name is the tombstone, if it has Hebrew on the stone, because the Hebrew usually includes not only the name of the deceased, but also the Hebrew name of the father. Location of tombstones in large cemeteries may also help with the origin in the old country. Here we see a tombstone, and remember, read right to left in this instance, and you'll see that I have highlighted different areas with color so that you can get an understanding of the kind of standardized tombstone. So things like dear or beloved, our father, but you'll see that in the below that first main line, the items that are in blue indicate that Lipa, aka Lipman, who is Ben, son of, is the son of Ari Leib, and Aryeh means lion. So, and then you'll also get usually the Jewish date of death, and then a traditional kind of acronym of a blessing for the individual. Having that, the Jewish name and the Hebrew name and the name of the father is huge in going forward. Here we have Solomon Frankfurt, who died in Delaware, and you'll see that I have highlighted in pink his Hebrew, which was Shlomi, aka Shlomo, and that he is the son of Judah. The Gutmans, so we have here Basha and Bezalel. This is actually Louis Gutman and Bessie Rosenfeld. One of the things that I was struggling with was how to get Louis out of Bezalel, because it doesn't usually translate. But I learned that he was the son of Yashua Zev, and that Basha was the daughter of Mordecai, aka Marcus. The Tzvi, her was identifying that her father was of the priestly Cohen line. Even if you know the death, it's important that you find the tombstone. Like if you've got a death record already, still look for the tombstone. One of the reasons that I suggest this is here is Shirley, the daughter of Louis Gutman and Bessie Rosenfeld. She married John E. Frankfurt. We started with their marriage record. Her Jewish given Hebrew name was Sasha. And you'll see that in this picture, she is actually the daughter of Bezalel Leib. It's Leib that gives us the Louis that her father ultimately takes when he is here in the United States. Cemeteries, as I mentioned, especially the larger ones in New York City, can offer you resources into where they were coming from. Cemetery plots, if the family is buried in a large city, such as New York City, it's possible their plot was purchased by what was known as a Landmanshaftn organization. Larger cemeteries may have many such sections of graves. In other words, these organizations would buy a large plot with many, many graves for members of their organization. Here we have Bessie Fetter, who died in 1893, and I was able to determine that she was buried in the Washington Cemetery. Now, this was one of the instances where I actually had to call the cemetery to find out exactly where she was buried. What I was able to learn was that she was in the Landmanshaftn Kletzger Bruder UV. This meant that I had some information. Now, the Landmanshaftn groups, they began with newly arrived immigrants pooling money together to aid with things such as a sick friend, a burial, a place to worship, also to help bring a landsman, a countryman, over. They formalized and also borrowed from their own experiences, as well as the more traditional fraternal orders that existed at the time. An excellent resource for the Landmanshaftn records of the YIVO collection at YIVO in New York City is Rosaline Swartz and Susan Millamed's A Guide to YIVO's Landmanshaftn Archive. Good news is that is now available online at this very long URL. I did include that in the handout at the back so that you can copy and paste that. When you go to that, you will find that the Landmanshaftn collection is arranged alphabetically. It's a massive list. What you can do, though, is, so in the case of Kletzger, I was able to look for Kletzger in this list and find information. I then made a trip from Boston to New York City to go to the YIVO archive, and I had identified certain organizations that I wanted to look at the records. And you'll remember that in Bessie's death, hers mentioned that she was part of the Kletzger Breeder UV, which is the let's see, it's the third one down, Independent Kletzger, Brüderliche und Verein, which was the organization that her family was a member of. However, you'll see that there are some other record groups as well. The Landmanshaftn usually includes the town from the old country. So this is why they play such an important role. Let's move on to the old country. Record availability in the old country may be found in a variety of different places and are contingent on the history of the area. You'll want to use the JewishGen.org website and Roots to Roots to see what records may exist and survive. It may require you to contact the archive, as few of their records have been digitized and put online. The Roots to Roots Foundation of Miriam Viner is my go-to when looking to see what archived records exist. Once in her website, you can put in the name of the locality. You can do exact match, some of the sound X variations, or you can do just begins with before you do a search. What you'll get is the item, in this case, the town of Kletsk, where it is now in Belarus, the oblast or district in Minsk, and then the types of documents that they have pertaining to Jewish individuals. So there are some census, Holocaust, immigration, etc. One of the items that I found was the census, and you'll notice the years that they have that are in existence. Again, these are not digitized. You may have to request that they do a search for you, and or they may tell you, no, you're going to have to hire somebody to do it because there's too many pages. Again, keep in mind that you need to remember what the name of the place is today. So Elizabethgrad changed its name to Kirovrad. And it's possible that through the special interest groups that they have begun to abstract records. So here we see that in Kirovrad, we've got birth, death, divorce, and marriage. If you click on the records in question, such as birth, what you'll get is a detailed listing of what exists and where the archive is, in this case, in Kirovrad. Then it becomes necessary to try and find the archive in question and see if you can reach out to them. In this case, Kirovrad did have an email that I was able to reach out to. I wrote originally in English. However, I did ultimately, there's a lot of back and forth with the archives. And so I was using both English and Russian. I will tell you, if you use Google Translate to write your Russian, please make sure your first sentence is, I am using Google Translate to communicate with you. And the reason for that is because you're not going to know if Google Translate translated correctly and you don't want to offend anybody. But I was asking them about Solomon Frankfurt and his wife, Mary Britsky. After a lot of back and forth and some difficulty paying for the document, I was finally able to get a birth record for Solomon Frankfurt. And as you can see, it was in Russian. The translation of that is what you'll see up at the top. Told me that he was the 231st male. The person who performed the bris was named Wolfram. That the date of birth and circumcision, both Christian and Jewish. So 15 December was the Christian date of birth, 27 December, the Jewish date of birth. The circumcision was done on the 22nd of December in the Christian calendar and on the 4th of January in the Jewish calendar. The place of birth was Elizabethgrad, and we had information about his parents, his father Yuda, and his wife Frema, and the name of him. So in review, It is important to identify Yiddish and Hebrew names of your ancestors. You do need to exhaust all records in the US. It's really important to understand the history of the old country, especially the Pale of Settlement and how it has changed over time. Keep in mind that the record keeping of the governing administrations may have varied, may have had difficulties, may have had destruction. You have to be patient when working with your Jewish ancestry, and it's really important to think outside the box.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Rhonda, for that great presentation. So much useful information there. As a reminder to everybody, there is a syllabus available to accompany this presentation, which Rhonda put together. It's available for purchase on our website. You'll find a link for that in the reminder email that went out earlier today from Zoom, and it will also be in our follow-up email that will go out this evening as well, so you can look for that. Before we get into all of your great questions that have coming in, I did just want to go over some upcoming events that we have this month. So on January 21st, we're hosting our virtual preservation roadshow, which is a wonderful program. You can learn how to preserve your family papers and receive personalized advice from our experts about an item in your collection. Then on January 26th, we will have another free webinar presented by our genealogist Ann Lothers on deciphering old handwriting. You'll get practical strategies for approaching handwritten documents and learn how to understand and decipher hard to read handwriting from different time periods. Finally, on January 31st, join author Adam D. Mendelsohn in conversation with Professor Jonathan D. Sarna as they discuss Mendelssohn's acclaimed new book, Jewish Soldiers and the Civil War, the Union Army. This event is also free and open to the public. All right, and so now we can go ahead and get into some of the great questions that have been coming in. So let's see here. All right, so a lot coming in here, so just scrolling through quickly. So Rhonda, we have a question here from someone who says, my ancestor's town in the Pale currently seems to exist in both Poland and Belarus. How can I narrow that down to the correct town?
So one of the things that I would do is maybe look at Roots for Roots and see if perhaps the records exist only in one archive. That might be the best way to go about it. You could also perhaps reach out. There are a couple of resources both at Family Search and JewishGen.org where you can ask questions and they might be able to help you as well.
All right, perfect. And since you mentioned JewishGen.org there, we also got a question about whether that's a subscription site or if it's free.
So technically it is free, but they have limitations on how you can search and how easily you can view certain things. If you donate to JewishGen.org, you have the flexibility of using some of their advanced search techniques, both in towns and surnames. If you donate to the various special interest groups for the area from which your ancestors came from, you may be able to see abstracts and or records sooner than when they finally make it onto their webpage.
Great, thank you. So then we had another question here. I think this is a common question that I've seen before. So we'll ask, did naturalization of the husband or father in a family automatically naturalize the wife and children as well?
Minor children were automatically naturalized when the father was naturalized and well into the 20th century. Women, however, prior to 1922, they were naturalized when their husband naturalized. After 1922, after the passage of the Cable Act, that severed that marriage connection. And so now you see women naturalizing as well.
Okay, great. And then we got a question here, I think in reference to the kind of historical context portion of the webinar. They're wondering, is there a particular reason that 1906 saw such a large amount of immigration?
In general, immigration in 1906 was just humongous. 1906, 1907 were the two largest years of US immigration. I think in part because of what was going on in the various European countries in general. Also, you had the shipping lines were much better and catering to passengers instead of people trying to find, some kind of place to sit on, like, the mail barges, etc. Also, you had the passenger liners, the passenger ship companies, they wanted to encourage people to come over. And so they're not only making better ships that travel faster, but they're also getting agents with boots on the ground in the various countries saying, hey, we'll take care of everything. We'll get you on your train. We'll get you, to the ship. And so you see more interaction.
Okay, great. Thank you. So let's see here. We also have a question about, apologies if I mispronounce this, the New York Landmanshaftn records that you mentioned. And they were wondering if that also would include New Jersey, or would it just be New York?
So the largest collection is in New York at YIVO, which is part of jhc.org. Or no, chj.org. Sorry about that. I get their URL and the Jewish Heritage Center, our group, kind of. It would be nice if they didn't have the same kind of letters. However, so the largest collection is in New York City, in large part because that's where you saw so many of the Jews. Like, we don't see it here in Massachusetts in the various cemeteries. Usually the cemeteries are like, it's all a Jewish cemetery. So these were cemeteries that existed for more than just Jewish burials. And so they wanted to ensure that there was some place for them to be buried. You could certainly look at the other cemeteries in larger cities and see if they have done something similar.
Okay, great. And I know we're kind of running against the clock here, but there's a lot of great questions, so we'll get to a few more. So there's another question here asking, what is the likelihood that Eastern European records no longer exist because they were destroyed during wars?
Yes, that is certainly a possibility, but it doesn't hurt to ask. Again, use the Roots to Roots Foundation website. She's done the hard work for you. She's been to all of these archives and she knows what exists. So start there, because she's going to tell you the years that exist, what archive has it. And so that way you have a much better way of finding or knowing if such exists.
Great. And we also have a question about records available online in Israel. Are you able to speak to that at all?
There are some records in Israel that exist that are online. Obviously, they will be in Hebrew, but that is going to be the bulk of people. And I know that there were some who had gone before World War II, but that is going to be for the bulk of people who went to Zion, like the Zionists who were looking for a place to settle. And that tended to happen predominantly after World War II, but you could certainly reach out to them. And they have websites, both some digitized records, but also you can reach out and communicate with them.
Okay, great. And then we also had a question here. We have somebody where their family immigrated from Eastern Europe to Montreal, and they were wondering if a lot of the tips that you shared today could also be applied to Canadian records.
So for the Canadian records, one of the big things is that, especially in Montreal, that is Quebec is a little different from some of the other provinces in that they don't have like county courthouses. They use individuals known as notaries to handle all legal documents. So researching there is a little bit different. Certainly naturalization records would still be a valuable resource because the people are going to have to naturalize this time to Canada. And keep in mind that the church records are possibly going to be in what is known as the Druan collection, which when they did predominantly up to the 1960s on some of the records. Some of it's on Ancestry, some of it's on a site called Genealogy Quebec.com. Prior to 1994, Quebec did not issue what we would consider vital records. In other words, birth, marriages, and deaths. That was all handled through the churches, so baptisms, etc., marriages, and burials. But the Druan collection does include some of the Jewish records.
Okay, great, thank you. And then we have a question here, wondering if you know the demographic breakdown of Jews in America in terms of Ashkenazi, Sephardic, etc.
The bulk is the Ashkenazi because that was the group, the large group that came over late 1800s, early 1900s from the Pale, in large part because of the pogroms. The Sephardic went and kind of did like this kind of weird migration because they went to Portugal. Then from Portugal, they went to Brazil, which was a Portuguese entity. And then they came up to the US. They trace back much earlier. So yes, they exist, but I don't, as far as the actual percentages, I would have to look that up.
Okay, great, thank you. And we are in overtime here, so I think we have time for just about one more question. So we have a question here saying, in cases where a country or portion of a country has changed hands, will the record likely be found with the original or the new country? And she says, for example, my great-grandmother came from an area that was part of Austria, but is currently part of Russia. Will those records be retained by the Austrians or the Russians?
So because of this is different from like when counties split off from other counties here in the US, where new county forms and they build a courthouse. And so records start from that point on. But usually records exist where it existed at, what existed at the time. Unfortunately, because of the back and forth of some of these countries under, who has dominion, etc. In your case, you're going to be turning towards Russia because the archive is now under the Russian flag.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Rhonda, again, for that wonderful presentation. And thank you to all of you watching for submitting such wonderful questions. A lot of great information there at the end through the questions as well. So unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. If we didn't get to your question, or if you think of one later on, you can contact us at education@nehgs.org, or you can also chat with our genealogists for free online Tuesday through Saturday from 9 to 5 Eastern Time, with extended hours Wednesday evenings from 9 to 8 p.m. This service is free and open to everyone and can be accessed at americanancestors.org/chat. I will say I saw a lot of questions coming through today that would be perfect for that chat. Our genealogists can help if you kind of have more specific questions about, a specific record you're looking for, a specific ancestor. It's really perfect for that. So again, americanancestors.org/chat, and it is free and open to everyone. So thank you again for joining us, and you will have an opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback on today's webinar. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any feedback is very helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to help keep these programs free and to create more. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. Thank you again, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.